A lot of countries have socialized healthcare systems. You got your usual suspects: Canada, Australia, virtually every nation in Europe, and even a couple of places that you really wouldn't think would have universal, publicly funded medical coverage. Argentina, Russia, Saudi Arabia, somehow. I don't really know how that works out, but it's there. That said, per capita healthcare spending in the U.S., which is about 9,000 per person, is actually higher than any country in the world. And in fact, only one nation, and it's a Pacific microstate called Tuvalu, which has less than 10,000 people, I think that should also be stated, spends a greater share of its gross domestic product on taxpayer subsidized health expenses. And I think what a lot of people kind of forget when we talk about the whole universal healthcare discussion is that the U.S. already spends 994 billion a year, almost 1 trillion, on its current Medicare and Medicaid programs. Those healthcare expenses represent a quarter of the entire federal budget, and like I said earlier, a far greater amount than any other country on earth spends on their healthcare programming. The thing is, low population countries like Austria and Luxembourg can implement effective single payer systems based simply on the fact that they don't have to cover as many people. However, in the US, there's a problem. We don't have, 12 to 20 million people. We don't even have 40 to 50 million like Canada. We have 319 million, and that is a very, very lowballed estimate. So just looking at that, $319 million, not million dollars, 319 million people, $994 billion, at least 600 billion almost on Medicaid expenses. You do the multiplications, the numbers just don't work. That said, you really can't tell that to Bernie Sanders and his supporters. Yes, Bernie Sanders, I know, he is the inevitable hyper-liberal riposte to Ron Paul. And I did videos about Ron Paul many, many years ago. Got the same flack I'm going to get for this one, but it still holds true. And in fact, even though they do come from two totally different spectrums of politics, they have a lot of similarities, Ron Paul and this Sanders guy. Both are really old. College kids love them for some inexplicable reason, and they both support economic policies so far removed from reality and anything we know about finance that you have to wonder what exactly they're putting in marijuana nowadays. Just not really making a whole lot of sense to me. That said, even though Ron Paul never really had a chance in two presidential campaigns, there's a good chance Sanders could win the Democratic nomination. I mean, that's possible. It could happen. In fact, it could be Bernie Sanders against Donald Trump in November in the election, which determines which political fringe ideology will destroy America. I can't wait for that one. I'm actually rooting for them despite everything I'm saying. But the thing is, even when you take into consideration Bernie's fusion of democratic socialism and Occupy Wall Street, hating rich people rancor, you're not really looking at his economic policies as practical. I mean, I know the 19-year-old kids, taking finger painting courses, and all the hippies who sold out, who are now, once again, gung-ho about socialism because they're not having to take money out of their paychecks. I understand the appeal. That said, there's this thing called arithmetic, and if you apply it to Sanders' policies, none of them work out. Just don't. None of them. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a look at some of Sanders' economic proposals. We're going to look at what he said they would cost, his funding mechanisms, and then look at some third-party responses and kind of show that these economic policies simply are not viable and they can't be implemented, and his entire platform is a bunch of bunk. So anyway, before we begin, let's take a look at exactly how much we are working with as far as economics. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the federal 2015 budget as a baseline. So all expenses added up last year for that fiscal year. The government, U.S. government, federal, spent $3.6 trillion. $525 billion went towards Medicare expenditures. Now, if you don't really know what that is, Medicare is a program in the U.S. which benefits only people who are over the age of 65. Now, granted, there are some people under the age of 65 who are eligible, but by and large, 65 and up, that's who it goes to. And as a conservative estimate, there are about 41 million people in the U.S. eligible for Medicare. So once again, doing the math, $525 billion in Medicare expenses, 41 million Medicare recipients. You divide that, you come out to about $13,000 per year spent on each Medicare recipient. Now, Bernie Sanders has said time and time again that he wants to build a Medicare for all type program. So, if we're spending about $13,000 a year on senior citizens for their Medicare program, if we want to offer that same comprehensive quality coverage, we're going to have to apply at least $13,000 a year to the other 278 million people in the U.S. And if you do that, you multiply, you end up with $3.6 trillion. So basically, you look at this proposal that he's throwing out here, to have a single payer system that provides similar services in scope and quality to Medicare, you literally have to double the federal budget. Now, of course, the Wall Street Journal, I think, said the proposal only cost $1.5 trillion. But even assuming that Bernie Care replaces Medicare and Medicaid, and all the other federal spending remains consistent with 2015 levels, we're still looking at about $4.5 trillion for the taxpayer tab. And just so you know, we only took in $3.2 trillion the federal government did from taxpayers last year. So that's a considerable deficit. So, where is Mr. Sanders going to get $1.5 trillion? All right, once again, before we go further, we have to look at the hard data. These are the numbers we're working with. If you've ever wondered exactly how much money is out there in the U.S., I'll explain to you. 2015, Federal Reserve guesses that there's about $84.9 trillion in the nation's total wealth. That includes not just money, but holdings, stocks, shares, equity, mortgages, outstanding debt, all of it, $84.9 trillion. That's all we have. But then again, about 12 trillion of that is in private debt. So you got another, 18 trillion in public debt. There's about 21 trillion tied up in New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ shares. So once you factor all that in, just at the end of the day, factoring out debts and money that can't actually be taxed, there's about 34 trillion possibly taxable dollars at the federal government's disposal. All right, back to the Bernie Care proposal. Gerald Friedman, he's an economist. He said that if we abolished medical insurance in the U.S. and implemented European-style pharmaceutical price controls, we would save about $592 billion a year, which sounds really great. That is, until you realize that if you did that, you would, number one, eliminate 1 million jobs and take a good $1 trillion out of the national economy. So if you implemented that, the negative dividend of installing that, of getting rid of the insurance industry in the U.S. and the subsequent effects on pharmaceutical prices, you actually take $1 trillion that possibly could have been taxed and basically eliminated $500 billion of it. So actually, if you do that, it's not a net gain of $592 billion, it's a net loss of about $500 billion. So just throwing that out there, you gotta look at it in perspective. So anyway, this is the first time Sanders has thrown out a Medicare for all proposal. Now, he hasn't announced officially how he's going to pay for it, which is warning sign number one. But in 2013, he proposed something called the American Health Security Act. And basically, he said he would be able to pay for a single-payer system by implementing a 2.2% across-the-board tax increase for all Americans, which is actually 8% because he's also increasing a 5.7% payroll tax increase, which, of course, employers are going to shift to employees. So basically, for even the single-payer system to even be floated up as an idea, you're automatically, as a working American, going to lose an additional 8% of your income. Something to think about. And that's also coupled with an additional 5.4% tax, which is graduated on high-income earners. But strangely enough, under this particular act of 2013, not corporations, which is a little funny. And of course, let's do a 0.02 tax on all securities transactions. More on that later. However, Politico, they did a report earlier who said that if you did all of that stuff that Bernie Sanders just said, you would only raise an additional $675 billion in tax revenue. So, according to his American Health Security Act of 2013 plan, it's supposed to pay off, this single-payer system, which we're going to say is at least $1.5 trillion, you're only going to get $665 billion. Not only is that enough to pay the single-payer system, that's $300 less to pay the actual Medicare and Medicaid programs that are already in place. Seems a little bad. And we know Sanders is always going against the 1% and the elite. But even if you tax the highest income bracket, if you raised their income levels, the taxation to 50%, where you take half the money, all the money, you take half of it, that's only going to get an extra $96 billion in revenue each year for the federal government, which really isn't a drop in the bucket. So unless Sanders has a really, really great plan to tax the 1% at absolutely astronomical levels, like 90%, and still find a way to keep them from moving to another country, there's just really no way Bernie Care can be implemented unless the middle class and working class tax rate goes up by at least double digits. So yeah, basically you can have your free health care right after you give up half your paycheck at the minimum. And the thing is, you take a look at Sanders, his home state of Vermont actually tried a single payer system, and after 4 years it crashed and burned. The state economy, the state budget to operate it had to increase. It went up, which I think is a very good indication of what would happen if it was taken on the national level. So even in Sanders' home state, this little micro experiment he did to see how a single payer system worked, it was a failure. And if you want to see how scary it really can get, you can go look at Brazil. They started a single payer system in 1988, and today it's one of the worst healthcare systems in the world. I think there's like one hospital bed for every 500 residents. You have to wait months to get an x-ray, and it's gotten so bad that the really rich people, the higher upper middle class, they're going to private services anyway just because public care is so lackluster. And here's the thing about the healthcare sector. It's a sixth of the U.S. economy. With such unparalleled government intrusion into it, there's going to be an obvious decline in quality, timeliness, and of course, accessibility of treatments and services. Now this is bad because when you take in the sudden astronomical shift in clients, and there's also a really big but kind of strangely underreported shortage of medical physicians coming out of colleges in the U.S. now, which is huge. It has all the makings of another 2008 style crisis. And if you think things got bad when the housing bubble burst, you just wait until the government has to pull hospitals out of the red using public subsidies that make the big bank bailouts look like a handful of spare change. But that's not the only policy proposal that Mr. Sanders has. He's got some ideas for tuition-free college and $1 trillion infrastructure reinvestment program. Well, there's a problem with his tuition-free college proposal. It's about $75 billion a year, but the subsidization proposal for students actually doesn't make college tuition free. Rather, it just lowers the student loan interest rate to 2%, and it would dole out double whatever states are already spending on tuition reduction programs. For example, I'm in Georgia. There's this thing called the Hope Scholarship. It's funded by the lottery. So basically, if Sanders' policy is implemented, the federal government would give them basically 200% whatever they're already spending on that program. That's kind of the general idea. Unfortunately, his idea to pay for it is a 0.5% tax on stock trades, a 0.1% tax on bonds, and a 0.005 tax on derivatives doesn't pan out. Tax Policy Center ran some assessments. It would only generate $50 billion a year, which leaves a third of the mandate unfunded. All right, he has an equally ambitious $200 billion a year infrastructure reinvestment proposal, which, like William James' moral equivalent of war, would allegedly put 13 million Americans to work building bridges, tarring highways, and that amount is actually double the amount the U.S. federal government spends on all federal transportation and regional development programs already. So, to pay for these programs, Sanders wants to tax corporations for their offshore and international earnings. Okay, that sounds good in theory, but even Sanders himself inadvertently kind of confessed that wasn't enough to cover the reinvestment costs. He actually went out to the Joint Committee on Taxation, asked them to do a report on how much money the government could get from taxing overseas holdings, and found out it would only generate about $90 billion a year. So that's less than half the amount Sanders actually says would pay for his sprawling public works initiative. He also has another program where you want to spend $2.75 billion a year to create 1 million jobs for unskilled youths by taxing carried interest on private equity and hedge funds, but that only generates $1.56 billion annually. So once again, that's only half the amount. So all right, to conclude, here's the thing. While Sanders' policies theoretically might work, pending the U.S. citizenry is okay taking on a virtually unpayable amount of debt in the long haul and handing over at least half their incomes to the feds at the gate, the financing plans he's shown up thus far are indisputably insufficient. That's not to say his proposals won't work if implemented, even though they almost certainly wouldn't, but there is no denying that for his castle and air programs to even get started, he's going to need a whole lot more dough than he's claiming, with the cost, of course, funneling right back to you, the involuntary consumer. Now, only time will tell how Sanders does as a presidential candidate. As far left as he is, however, even if he does somehow win an upset bid, one has to wonder if his money-burning ways are too lavish even for the Democrats in Congress. Over the next 10 years, Sanders' entitlement initiatives alone are tabbed at $18 trillion, and his stated taxation plan still leaves open about $11.5 trillion in funding. So progressive they may be, a lot of middle-class liberals still like capitalism, and strangely enough, Sanders' proposals actually screw over working-class Dems who, with all the new taxes implemented, would actually be thrust into poverty. Now, underemployed baristas and guys who vape and play League of Legends in their parents' basements all day may worship at his feet, but I'm guessing a lot of moderates aren't exactly feeling the burn in a good way. Considering the mathematical unworkability of his proposals, even his staunchest supporters might wind up regretting their naive hero worship once the economic toll of all of those grandiose projects and programs shows up on their paychecks. So basically, for all you Sanders supporters out there, just be careful what you wish for. You might just end up with him in the Oval Office, and with it, a much, much lighter wallet than you'd expected.